All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Peter Ebbers. It's July 8th, 2025. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. First question is, why wine?
Well, my party story I tell people is that this is true, that I got told by my professor that I would be a bad academic, that I was a bad student. I went to school for history and English and thought I was going to be a college professor, or that seemed like that was the appropriate interest of what I wanted to be doing. And I went going to school with a lot of kind of heady people. It seemed like, oh, this is like the cool thing to do. That's not being a professional, or trying to be a banker. It's the right thing. And then a couple things happened. One, I studied abroad in Scotland. I did not get into the Oxford program at school. I was the last one out, and so it was a prestigious program. And so I went to Scotland, where I got exposed from friends to jazz and wine and whiskey. Those were like the three things that I spent. We only had 4 hours of class a week, and it was worth 16 credits, so it was a full term. But I just went to class 2 days a week for a couple hours each day. And I grew up with a dad who was a home brewer and is a retired engineer. And so he kind of said, hey, pay attention to what you're drinking when you're in Scotland, drink good beer, focus on that. And I came from a house that my parents drank, but it wasn't, we were still conservative, and so it was like maybe one drink a night or so. But when I was in Scotland, these two American girls came up to me and said, you should come to this wine and cheese club, this club that we have, this program. And I said, well, why me? And they said, well, we know you have a suit and you have to wear a shirt and tie and a suit jacket to come to the club. And two, you're the only person we know who smells his beer. And I didn't know this, but I was smelling beers that I was drinking. And I would go out for drinking, and I would not go have a vodka tonic. I'd have a good beer, and then we'd go out dancing and do that stuff later. But so in my studies in Scotland, the first night was a guy who had a wine shop in Edinburgh came, and he poured 6 wines, and I think he'd just come back from New Zealand. So it was kind of like a tour of New Zealand wines. And that was the first time I realized that people in New Zealand were trying to make something that people in a different part of the world in France had been trying to perfect for thousands of years. And so this conglomeration of French monks improving on something and then trying to do that in the same way in New Zealand, but respectful of their own landscape and their own people and culture. And then here we are in Scotland, again on the other side of the world, reviewing it and talking about it and saying how much we're going to pay for it. And I left that first night. Not only was it was a good price, it was £6 for 7 glasses of wine. So it was a good economical proposition. But I was like, I want to learn more about wine. I want to get exposed to this. And I went back to school for my senior year in Williamsburg, and I wanted to write a senior thesis, and I wanted to write about antebellum South and the pressure of Western frontier on it, or more on how the Western frontier, all pre-Civil War stuff, just in that kind of dialogue between the politicians in the South and the settlers in the West. Mm-hmm. And my professor said, well, you got a big course load, you're double majoring in English. He goes, and you're not really a good student. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, well, you get good grades and you hand in papers. He's like, your papers don't show that you are writing multiple drafts. And I said, that's true. And another teacher I had in the program was she found out that I was writing papers the night before, a 30-page paper. and getting like an A-. And she's like, the editing's not there, the work's not there. She's like, you're baking a cake without the eggs. Like, you're just not. And so this professor challenged me, and he said, why don't you spend this year, your senior year, working on developing your academia skills? And then he also said, let's just head the horse off right now. He goes, I'm not going to write you a recommendation to grad school. For right now, he goes, I'll write you one in 3 years. And I said, why in 3 years? He's like, I have 2 other people I've done this for. He's like, I'll write your recommendation and we'll put it in this envelope and you can come back for it 3 years after you graduate. And he said, and this professor, Scott Nelson, I think he'd taken 8 years off halfway through his undergrad. So he came back to undergrad as like a 26-year-old, or I want to say like, or 20, he took several years off for undergrad, then took another like 6 or 7 years off, and then went right through master's, PhD, and now is probably in his late 40s, early 50s teaching. And he did it to become like a software engineer, and then went back to American history. I don't know how you do that, but he was like, you should be doing something after you graduate that gets you up in the morning and makes you want to do what you want to do. And I was like, okay. And he goes, well, what is that? Like, what is that? He's like, what's the best thing you can think of? I said, well, the best job I've ever had is house painting. And I said, I've done it for the last 2 or 3 summers. I work with this guy who's a 3rd-generation house painter. We work on a lot of historic houses, just like the flow of it. And he's like, maybe you should house paint. And so I graduated, got through my senior year, graduated, went into kind of a fellows program with a church in another town in Charlottesville, Virginia, where we did some volunteer service with their youth ministry. We took grad study courses and then also worked a job. And I finished that program and kind of was saying, I want to go back. I want to do something more tangible, practical. Like this guy, Scott's words were still in my head. And I didn't really know what I was going to do, but all around the same couple of weeks, a friend of mine, my uncle, all were like, you still get super excited about wine. Like they said, you're still the only person we know that like smiles and smells it and like, have you ever thought about it? And I said, yeah. And I looked at it, and there's an alumni from my school named Kent Fortner who started his own wine label in California. And I wrote him, and he said, come to the Napa Valley. And I said, I don't want to come from Virginia. I don't want to go across the country. I don't want to go. So I ended up working in the Virginia wine industry for a year. I had my top 2 places I wanted to work. So I called the 3rd place, and the day I called them was the day after their H1A or H2 visa workers had fled, had gotten into the country, been working for a few weeks, and then departed and had fled to go be with other friends and so they were desperate. And so I started in April, and I worked all summer in viticulture in the vineyards, helping out a little in the winery, but got a pesticide applicator's license just because my boss said that's how I would get ahead, and raised wires and did a lot of crew work. And then about 2 weeks before harvest, this microburst storm came through and knocked out half our white fruit, and the whole vineyard smelled like vinegar about 2 days later. And so I called my dad and I said, Dad, I don't ever want to be a farmer. I said, because as Ed, who is the vineyard manager, he's like, as Ed says, farming, and then when you have ripe fruit or almost ripe fruit, is kind of like dropping your pants and facing God and say, kick me. I'm waiting. And I just said, I don't ever want to farm because you're out of control. I think I want to go into winemaking. Farming is out of, nature is always going to beat man. And so I went into the cellar and we did the harvest and did almost everything by hand, lifting totes, and I'd get up in the mornings and help with the picks, and it was amazing. Like everything sensory, smelling, tasting, everything you kind of hear about and is like your dream of working in a cellar or at least what the tourists kind of see is like, was right there, and I loved it. And I worked with a South African winemaker named Stephen Barnard, and he said, you can work with me and be an assistant winemaker in 3 years, or you can go swim in the bigger pond. And you know, he's like, he came from South Africa, and he's like, you can go to South Africa and travel. You're 22 and learn from everyone and do that. And so that was, he lined me up with a job in South Africa, but I kind of got scared, and I just was like, I don't know if I want to commit to this. So I started working at a public school, and within about a month, I was like, oh, I'm not an educator. Maybe my professor was right. I was like, these middle school students don't want to learn about history and English. They just want to goof off. So the next year in 2008, I moved out to the Napa Valley, and I worked at Larkmead there with a winemaker named Andy Smith, who was consulting, and another winemaker named Dan Petrosky, who went on to found his own label, which became the first all white wines label in Napa Valley, called Massican. And that was a really amazing harvest. It was so professional, and I remember being there in August, and we were unloading barrels, and it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was 110 degrees, and I was like, oh, this is how you ripen fruit. Like, this is how good wines are grown. Like, because in Virginia, it could be 70 degrees and humid, and diseases at your door, or a rainstorm, you know, this microburst comes through. And so it just was like, oh, like, a real wine growing region really is like set up for success. And yeah, I worked at Larkmead for 2008 into November, and the winemaker Andy Smith he has his own winery called Dumal in the Russian River, and really it was two of us. I worked with a South African intern and at Larkmead, and he had a couple of interns at the other winery, but they treat us like family, and so we regularly had meals together. And so I told him, I want to keep going. I want to keep making wine. I want to keep exploring. Where should I go next? And he said to go to, he's like, well, I have a friend from grad school in New Zealand. Do you want to go to New Zealand? So I went down to Central Otago to Gibson Valley to work with his classmate, Chris Keys. Both of them went to Lincoln University, which is the big ag wine school in New Zealand. And so I worked there for 6 months, had a great experience, learned more, thought Pinot Noir was really cool and beautiful. But I always had this like penchant for Syrah, and so I was like, I'm going to go work in the Northern Rhone. And so I put my resumes together, and I applied to a place called Literai in Sonoma County and Ridge Vineyards. And a friend of mine had a friend at Ridge, and there was this job to work all year as an assistant vineyard manager and then go into the cellar and be an assistant winemaker. But I got this job to go to Condrieu in the Northern Rhone. And I said, that's where I'm going. And so I came back to Vermont in June. I grew up in Vermont in upstate New York. And I said, Mom, Dad, I'm going to France in September. Paperwork's on its way. We're all good. And I went back to house painting, which I had done a lot of summers, still working with the same guy. And it's coming around Labor Day weekend, and my paperwork hadn't come through for harvest. And so I called the consulate, and they said, we don't have a full document. So I called again, they said, we still don't have it. And so I called Lyon once, twice, and then finally I got someone through, and they said, well, the person who filed that is on maternity leave, is gone. We can't do anything. So I called the Boston consulate, and they said, we have 2 of the 3 pages of the document. We just need the 3rd page. And the people in Lyon, I called the French consulate back, and they said, we can't help you. So I talked with the assistant winemaker there, and I said I can come on the tourist visa and just help out for this guy named Francois Villard. And she said, we would prefer you don't come. And I spent 48 hours trying to figure out what to do. And my house painter boss, who in general, just taught me a lot about work ethic and life and all that, said, you gotta get out of here. Like you have to go try to work a harvest. You can always come back and work for me. Like, he's like, what are you thinking? I said, well, I'm thinking about driving cross country. And this would have been, I guess, so I'd driven out cross country to Napa, come back, and this was me driving again, so the third time. And he said, yeah, he's like, just go. And then the whole way across, this is, the age of flip phones and all that, people were like, well, no, we need an intern now, and you have a Vermont cell number, and we're not really interested. And I got to Colorado, to Denver, where my high school friend was living, and he just said, hey, I'm working, like I got in, he's like, I'm working today, but I can take tomorrow off. Like, let's just take a day off and like go on a hike and explore. Like, you don't have a job yet. And we did that, and we hung out, and I got a phone call that evening from my friend Charlie, who I had worked with in New Zealand, and he said that Joe Dobbs was hiring in Dundee, and I think it was Labor Day weekend, so Monday was off, and he said, and so I called them, and they said on Saturday evening, they said, if you can be here by Tuesday morning at 7, we'll hire you. So I got back on the car on Sunday and started driving, and I remember driving down the gorge and calling my friend Charlie and saying, Charlie, I don't even know where I'm going to stay. Can I stay with you? And he goes, no, you cannot stay with me. He's like, I'm renting a room. He goes, but I have a friend who has a setup for you. Just get here. So I remember driving down 99W, going through Portland, driving down 99W, and I got to Yamhill, and they said, just keep going west. And I stayed with this family, and they said, well, we're not going to charge you any rent, but we have a tack room in our pole barn with a mattress in it, and you can, in the horse stall has hot water, and you can stay here for as long as you need. And there's a porta potty outside. And so I came, and I showed up in Dundee for Dobbs in Tuesday, and they said, yeah, we'll hire you. And I'd always worked at these, I guess I would say smaller wineries, like 5,000 cases or less, maybe 10,000, but just pretty small teams. And Wine by Joe, Dobbs was a 2-location, truckloads of fruit, just kind of really rolling through. And the other factor was my friend Charlie was working at this other place, and I didn't know anyone. And I was living in a pole barn. And so I worked as many hours as I could, and I think I had 5 days off, and I tasted wines on those days and explored, and by the end, maybe people talk about this with harvest, but as the weather, maybe it's me also with like seasonal light disorder, like you just kind of get glummer and the work slows down, and especially if you're going from gig to gig, you're like, oh, I'm making less money each week, like this is gonna wrap up, and I don't have a plan on what to do, and I don't think they're gonna hire me on full time. And so, yeah, I would work as much as I could, either go out to dinner or eat a sandwich at home, or I had like a hot kettle and I'd make instant ramen. And I came from very practical parents who were just like, do what you want to do. Like my father was an engineer and my mom was a trained nurse. And so liberal arts didn't make sense to them. And wine didn't really make sense to them, except both of them just said, don't go into debt. Like, stay in the black. I mean, that was a life kind of a lesson, and so my harvest wrapped up and faster than I expected, and I found myself driving back again to the East Coast, and I made it in time for Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving was upstate New York at my grandparents' house, so a lot of 10-hour days just driving, and with no clue what I was going to do next. But I was like, I could go try to work in the Southern Hemisphere, but I think I was just tired of that nomadic life of like, that was just that's not my lifestyle. And Guy Cabell, who I'd worked with Andy Smith, he's again the winemaker at Costa Brown, but Cabell Corsi, he he had worked for Andy, and then when I was in New Zealand and then in Oregon, he had gone to Lincoln University. I have a one-year grad diploma program, and I had visited him when I was in New Zealand, and I had talked with both the two winemakers I'd known who'd done the grad program course, and I looked at going back to grad school because now maybe 3 years have been up. I could go back to some sort of grad school, not history for sure. No more paper writing, but I went to Lincoln. And we had an old family friend in Vermont who had gone to Lincoln in the 50s, and he was Kiwi or from New Zealand, and he had done dairy it was his specialty, and so he had worked in the United States and had done dairy setup. New Zealand has this unsheltered, the cows aren't outside, they're out in the pasture all the time, and it's a crop rotation, always green grass. Kind of continuous cycle, which is very different than Northeast New England dairy is put the cows in for the winter, you feed them feed, straw, that sort of stuff, and then you put them out on the pastures. So he'd set up in a couple places in Vermont these full cycles, and he had moved into other stuff. But he was excited that I was considering Lincoln. And I guess I wanted to bring, his name was Doug Parker. I wanted to bring his name up because one thing he told me one time in a car ride, because we were going somewhere, it was like Christmas holidays, and his family, my sister-in-law, my brother's wife, used to live with his family when she was in undergrad. And so we were going to something, and he's like, I want to ride with you and tell you about Lincoln University. And the one thing he said about Lincoln University that, again, kind of like Dave, the house painter, that registered with me, is he's like, Lincoln is going to teach you how to use your land, your workforce, your technology, your capital, and your know-how, your like intelligence to raise the best crop. And he said, you never get all five. He goes, you'll have a bad piece of land, you'll have a poor or hard to find workforce, you'll have bad technology, crappy tractors, like no tools. He goes, hopefully you don't have a lack of intelligence and ingenuity. And he goes, but you probably won't have, if you have capital and you have tractors, he goes, you might have an owner who has a lack of intelligence. But he said that like kind of this rubric or paradigm of like how to evaluate something, and it's been just very true to me in general. Like when you look at any sort of a farming, I think farming and wine type of things, you can see places that have the money and they have that resource, but they maybe don't have the balance of workforce, or they don't have the smarts. Intelligence can be like ingenuity, but can also be like soul or like can do. But so I ended up going to Lincoln for a year in 2010, and it was a good experience. It wasn't great. It was not, I think I chose to go to Lincoln because I didn't want to go to Davis and have to write a master's thesis, and I didn't want to have to take more science courses. I realized by that time I felt like if I'm going to be in this industry, I'm never going to be the person in the lab coat, I'm never going to be the smartest. I was still bridging the gap between winemaking and growing there. Thought they were really connected, but I just knew that I was not going to be the smartest person in the room on the Krebs cycle. And on the same level, I didn't really want to spend 2.5 years. I didn't want to take the foot off the gas to go to school in that way. And Lincoln was hard in that like we had to write papers, and just doing some of those assignments, my bad student tendencies came back, and it just was like, I don't want to write a 50-page lit review on rootstocks. Like, can't I just do in the last 2 days, which is what I ended up doing. But enough said there. But so I went there for a year, but it was a great experience of kind of like St. Andrews, where I was in Scotland. The academics were not that rigorous, and so I read a lot. I read a lot of books that were in the library about farming and agriculture and wine, and that's where I got exposed to Sir Albert Howard and kind of like in biodynamics and just kind of taking deep dives into primary sources that you maybe hear about in the wine industry, but it's like who's actually read this or who's done this. I mean, like I guess when I was in history and English as an undergrad, my friends and I joked, but we read a lot of like poetry when we were supposed to be studying for something else. It's like, oh, have you actually read so-and-so's this? Because it was like the distraction. It was still rigorous, but it was not an assignment, so it was kind of cool to read that and I had a friend who was at Lincoln who was a film studies major at Texas, and he was getting a grad degree like me. He's now a cider maker, and so he had like 50 DVDs from films. So we watched like Jim Jarmusch films and all the Coen brothers films. And so I'd watch one a week with him. And then in between wine classes, we'd sit and have a coffee at the student union and talk about, his name was Nick, so we called him Nick Flicks, which Nick Flicks he'd given me. So, I mean, we watched French New Wave. It was kind of like, and sometimes we watched them together, or he'd watch it again, and then I'd watch it, the DVD, and then we'd discuss it. And so, like, it was just this time to kind of like just stretch and like not work for, like a 9 to 5 and just be a student. And after Lincoln, it was kind of like the situation in deciding to go to France. Before I even returned to New Zealand, I knew the 2 or 3 producers I really wanted to work with. And the best Pinots I had, and the place that was most interesting was this guy named Larry McKenna in Martinborough. And so I think in the first semester, he came down to Christchurch for a tasting. And I started chatting with him, and we kept chatting. And then he kind of was like, okay, well, just get to your point. And I said, what point do you think I'm trying to make? And he goes, and he's like, well, he's like, he's like, I'm assuming you want a job after you graduate. And I said, yeah. And he goes, okay. He's like, well, talk to me that summer. I said, no, I graduate, I want to come and work in the vineyard. I want to come. And he's like, okay. He's like, remind me of your name again in a couple weeks. So I talked with some other people at some other spots, but I still wanted to go work with him. And then I called him, and he said, great. And then he had forgotten to tell his vineyard manager. So about a week before I showed up, he goes, we don't actually have a role for you. He goes, you're just going to be a crew guy. And he goes, you're actually not even going to work with us. You're going to work for a local contractor. And so you'll be working on our vineyards and other people's vineyards. So I spent a year in Martinborough working in the vineyards and working with a contractor, which again, all of it was it would have been cooler maybe to work every day at the winery, but again, they took really good care of me and invited me to tastings before harvest and walked through it all. But I spent a lot of time at other sites in Martinborough and kind of seeing how contract crews work and how some sites you really just kind of roll in to get as much done as quickly as possible. If it was house painting, it would be a place you spray painted, you just like sprayed it and left. And then there's other sites, which in house painting are like the 150-year-old house where you're scraping and you're re-nailing nails into the siding and you're looking to repair dry rot and you're doing all this sort of stuff, just knowing like the business sense of knowing like, oh, this is a quick and dirty, or this is like a finely tuned machine and we're in conversation. And had a great harvest experience with them. We worked a lot. I got a navel hernia, which we would stack barrels 6 high in the cellar, and it was myself and his assistant winemaker, and then we had an English kid who was 18 who was there for 2 weeks, and then we had an American woman who was there for about 5 weeks. But we did around 300 tons of Pinot, which meant that each fermenter got filled 3 times, and some of them got filled 4 times. It was a very tight ship winery, and we'd stack the barrels 6 high, and I think that's where the hernia happened. And I just recently got the hernia repaired 9 years later. Between my first and second child, timing when to get a hernia repair and when you can lift so many pounds when you work in agriculture and you have little kids was definitely And my wife would be like, do not lift her up onto the swing, like when I was getting. But the kindest thing that Larry and Hugh, Larry I think is still working at Escarpment or is like in emeritus, and Hugh is at Pyramid Valley, was they would let me taste wines post-ferment and go through everything. And Larry told me, he's like, stop asking me why you do this. He's like, ask me how. He's like, and don't ask when. He's like, ask how, with what. He's like, you should know the whys, or you already know them. You can observe the when. He's like, you have all the winemaking knowledge I have, you just don't have the experience. So now you have to fill in your winemaking knowledge with experience to shape your decision making. And that was really encouraging and empowering. And it was also just like a refresher reminder that, like, to me, each year, each vintage is a new, and you're coming in maybe kind of like what Doug said about the 5 things each farm has, the land, and it's like everything has these like generalizations, and then how you support them and fill them in works. And that actually, I tell people a lot of that reminds me of writing papers last minute in grad school, because it's like, as an undergrad, if your professor is saying, well, argue this point, or, it's like a blue book kind of a test. And it's like, okay, so how am I going to support this historical interpretation of this? How, like, what things are going to improve my argument? And so a lot of, again, like, just having these people along the way who, none of them really, I never had anyone who like blew smoke up my ass and was like, you're really smart, or you're this. It was just like, no, you have this preparation, figure out what you're missing, figure out where to go. And so I spent a year in Martinborough, in a town of 1,000 people, as the one American person over 6 feet tall. And that was, I tell people after my first 6 months in Central Otago, I lived in a basement apartment that had no heating, and had like a little kind of plug-in heater, and it also had no dryer. So it would be 45 degrees outside, and we'd be hanging our wash out, hoping it would dry. And as a guy who grew up in Vermont, upstate New York, with a lot of snow, that was fine, but it just felt cold to your bones all the time. And so I told my parents I would never go back to New Zealand unless I got like a big down jacket. And that's what I got for Christmas before I went to Lincoln. And then I spent that year in New Zealand, and I said I will not go back unless I have like a wife or a girlfriend, because spending a year again in the small town kind of just was like too much free time on your hands and just kind of a boredom. So I have really fun memories, like, get-togethers with friends, but it was also just a lot of head-down work. And I came back. I looked at immigrating there, but my folks really wanted me to stay closer. I mean, not closer, but on the other side of the country. They just felt like New Zealand was too far away. And I guess a side note on that is my mom. I have an older brother, and my older brother lives 30 minutes away, but they would, even during this time, they would see him every like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, right? Like you just don't. But my mom's like, we haven't seen you. And I'm like, I come home and I live with you guys for months and like play games and all this. And then I go away for months. Like, why? Like, but my mom's like, it just would be nice if you're on the same continent. And I said, okay. And so I came back and I worked in California in 2011 and 2012. In the fall of 2012, my dad retired early from IBM, and he and my mom moved to Zambia so that my dad could become a medical director of a children's hospital there through a nonprofit Christian charity. And that's when I was like, I moved back to the States so you could go to Zambia. but it was a good experience. I mean, my parents were there for 4 years, and it was a good experience for them and for me. But my mom kind of got to experience. My mom never studied abroad, or she got to experience that life out of a suitcase. That was my period in my 20s, and so we traded a lot of stories during that time about that like everything's adventure and new, but at the same time, you kind of want to just be a creature of comfort and stay there. And I think that's just human nature. So I was in California and I worked with Ted Lemon at Literati for about 5 months. And that also felt like a capstone job where when I was talking with them about, I had applied and they had accepted me back in 2009, and I said I wanted to go to France, and they understood. And so when I came back in 2011 and asked if I could come, they said, great. And they said, but what do you really want to do? Like, you got a lot of experience. And I said, I really just want to see the vineyards. And we sourced a lot of fruit out of Anderson Valley, which is about 2 hours north. And kind of true to his word, Ted, like, I didn't realize it. We had a couple other interns who had experience, but it was like a year or 2 years, and I was going on like 5 years. And so I would go up to Anderson Valley 2-3 times a week. And I guess that was another one of those experiences where the day-to-day felt like kind of like being in working with the crew in Martinborough. It was like the day-to-day was just this kind of like drudgery, it's like wire lifting, or, oh, I'm going to go up and walk these sites and count clusters again and do very non-dynamic, just kind of like quantitative work. Why did I choose this? But then as the weeks played out, I was realizing that, like, well, one, you're getting to, like, I never took for granted, I always wanted to do the winemaking and vineyard side, but I never took for granted how important I felt it was to be out in the vineyard and seeing what was going on. Because that's what all the winemakers talk about. Like Andy in Napa would be like, oh, he's like, the most important part of my work is in the vineyard. And I was like, but why are all the assistant winemakers in Napa like in the cellar all the time? And like, why is it always like the vineyard, like why is there that tension in the industry? Just never made sense. And Ted would go out to the vineyards once a week, but I realized from him, like, oh, this, again, it was another time to just kind of like absorb and observe, and we were pulling from a lot of just one parcel from well-known vineyards, and so you could sneak in and look at what other people's vineyards were like, and just kind of like say, oh, that winemaker's doing this, or that's the growing style, and this is the evaluation, and not like comparative, but just it's kind of like what Larry was saying too. It's just building experience and seeing how different things go. And the thing that really made me realize what I learned was I came back from the Anderson Valley, and the other folks are still in the cellar. We haven't really harvested that much. I mean, we're still probably like 3 or 4 weeks away. And I come back from Anderson Valley, and they're doing some random cleaning job, and it's like, well, I'm pitching in, I get out of the car and I'm down scrubbing or whatever's happening. And then we have a beer, and it's like 6 o'clock at night, and I'm walking back to my car, and the assistant winemaker comes out and says, because we had to park across this field, he goes, hey, you need to go back to Ted's office. He wants to speak with you. And when you work with, I mean, I admired this guy, and it was kind of just like, oh, I don't spend that much time with you, and now you're calling me in your office at 6, like, and it maybe was a Friday. And I walked in, and I walked into his office, and he held his finger up like 1 minute, and I was like, oh, didn't know if I should wait outside or not, but I sat down. And then he goes, here, I'm gonna put the phone down. He goes, I need to talk with Peter, then I'll get back to you. And then Ted looks at me and goes, hey, I'm talking with one of the guys up in Anderson Valley at the site, and he goes, I read your notes on what you saw. He goes, so I need you to give me a thinning instruction. What should I tell the crew about how to drop fruit so we can get to our yield target and get homogeneous ripening? And as you probably know in this conversation, I get wordy. And so I started going, well, Ted, I saw this and I saw that. And he goes, stop it right there. He's like, with a thinning instruction, he goes, I need it in 2 sentences and preferably in Spanish. and I paused, and then he goes, it doesn't have to be in Spanish. He's like, it doesn't have to be in Spanish. And then I said, okay, I would go to a 1-2-1-2. I said, and I would make sure to remove the wings in this block, but not in this block. And then this block, I got it down to 2 sentences, and he said, great. And then he said, that's actually something you should think about. And that's something I think about almost every day working with a crew now, is it's like, we think we're making this really big, complicated thing, but pretty much everything should get boiled down to 2 sentences, preferably in Spanish. As a vineyard manager, it's every task, that's my yardstick. It's like, can I teach someone to do it this way and this? If you do more, you're probably asking them to overdo it or overthink it, or you don't actually have a really good understanding of what needs to be done, or that's step 2 or 3. And after working with Ted, there was no magical job, no magical here's your office type of a situation, and there was none with the neighbors. And I kind of was, and he said, well, he's like, you want to be an assistant winemaker and you want to be a vineyard manager, so he goes, you can kind of hang around and wait and see what happens, or you can do what you want to do. He goes, but probably if you're going to get a job in who you are, he's like, you're probably going to want to be living in Anderson Valley. And Anderson Valley is more remote than Willow Minor or Sheridan. I again was I had left New Zealand with no girlfriend. I was not a prolific dater, but I just was like, that sounds like another boring, lonely community. And so I went home for Christmas and for a couple weeks and had phone interviews to be an assistant winemaker in Napa. And this one place in Napa said, can you come back early on the 2nd to have a job interview? And I went in and I sat down with them in Calistoga, where I had lived previously, and had this really nice conversation, and it was all going great. And they said, well, great. They said, so if you live here, they said, when you have the job, will you live here in Calistoga, or where do you think you want to live? And I think I remember my face just fell, kind of like this. And then the husband of the family that owns it goes, oh, you would live in Healdsburg. That's where more of the young people live. And I said, thank you, it was great to chat, and I got in the car and I was driving back over. I was staying on the Santa Rosa, on the Sonoma side of the mountains. And I drove back, and the whole time I was like, I don't want to live in the Napa Valley. I don't want to be here. And that's when I was like, well, where can I do what I want to do? And that was Oregon. And I was like, where can I be in the vineyard, but also have a foot in the winery? Where can I, I had this other sensation when I was in Napa the second time in Sonoma, where again, living in Vermont, it felt crowded, hot, and dried out. In the places to live, practically speaking, I was like, if I'm a 26-year-old, if in 10 years I'm a success in my industry and making 6 figures, which you kind of have to make it's like, am I going to be able to afford a house? Am I going to have a quality of life? Is this a dream, or is this still is this a reality? And Oregon was the place that made sense. And so I would not say I'm a risk taker or a nomad, but I packed up my car from how I was staying with friends in Sebastopol who He was a sommelier and she was a wine salesman, and they had moved out from New York City, and they had let me essentially crash in their guest room for 3 weeks. And they said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm just going to go up to Oregon." So I put 2 duffel bags and 2 cases of wine in the car, and I drove up, and there was snow in the passes. So in Reading, I bought chains. The first time I came to Napa, I had a Honda Accord station wagon, and in the first 2 days, I got rear-ended going into St. Helena, and I got totaled. So I got to drive the winery truck around for a couple weeks, which maybe it was a big F-350. I felt like this big man in Napa. But then I bought a 1982 Mercedes-Benz 380 SEL, which is this extended length coupe brown, and I bought it for $1,000. And I drove that to and from Vermont 5 times, or one direction each way was 5. I did 5 times, and I just put new tires on it and oil changes, and I did brakes one time in the apartment I lived in Santa Rosa in the parking lot. But it was a great car, and so I drove that up to Oregon and didn't know where I was going to stay. And I had one friend in Oregon who I met from school in Virginia, and he was currently in Korea. And so he said, "Good luck." And so I checked into the youth hostel on Hawthorne with kind of no idea what I was going to do. And the first thing they tell you when you check in is that you can only stay there for 5 nights because they don't want transients. And it's like, well, I feel like a transient with just 2 bags. But after 2 days of being at the youth hostel and getting my bearings, their work study person magically called and said, "I can't be there." And the youth hostel came to me and said, "Do you want to stay with us for 6 weeks? You can stay for free, but you have to do 15 hours a week of bathroom cleaning and laundry." And also, they always seemed to move me into I would get moved every couple of days into a different dorm room situation, and it was always with the drunks and the rowdy people. But it was a hostile experience, but it gave me runway. And in those 6 weeks, I started cold calling winemakers and just saying, "Can I help you bottle?" And so I bottled for a lot of people like Jay Summers, Jim Prosser at J.K. Carrier, I think the folks at Chehalem. I ran into Mike Etzel Jr., who's now a good friend, and his wife and I are friends, and our kids are friends. He knew my friend Cabell, but I ran into him in a wine shop in Portland, and he said, "Come out and bottle for my brothers and my label." And so and by bottling with these people, they started just passing your resume around. So having within those first 3 weeks, I chatted with the folks at Domaine Drouin, with Laurent at Northwest, with Brian at Belpont. Dick Shea was hiring a winemaker, and so someone put my name in, and he called me, and I was like, "I've never been an assistant winemaker. I don't know if I should be a winemaker for Shea, But Dick and I had an interview conversation, and we both kind of knew it was not the right thing. But I ended up working for Jim Prosser at J.K. Carrier. I had bottled enough with him, and he had 10 acres at that time, and it seemed like this right fit and right scale for me to go in and work with someone on the wines, but then also still be growing. He was also sourcing fruit from Shea, Anderson family, Temperance, and a site up in Sherwood called Gemini, which has been renamed. I don't know. But so I was working with him, and he just kind of kept giving me more hours. And then his assistant, who was an old friend of his who kind of was filling the gaps, told me I'm going to be leaving in a couple weeks. And so I stepped in, and I worked for Jim for 18 months and did a harvest with him and helped him grow and do a cellar. But Jim and I have different personalities, and I mean, to dwell on the bad first, there was one time when Jim said, "Embrace the tension, and it's okay to just get angry at each other." And that's not now after 10 years of marriage, I also realized like I grew up in a house where anger was I didn't really ever see my parents get upset or yell at each other. I saw my mom get frustrated at my dad if the car was overheating on like a hot summer day and you're driving down 95 in between like Tennessee and North Carolina or something, not Tennessee, but North Carolina and South Carolina. But working with Jim, I got to live the dream. I mean, so I also decided to live in Portland because it's like I'm 26. I want to be able to park the car, go out to bars, go see friends, and do that. And so I got to live that awesome life that is, in some ways, part of the Oregon history dream of like being in a city that's not too big a city, but being able to be out in the country in 40 minutes and drive a tractor, work with a crew, be in touch with the weather. I mean, I think it was really interesting to me with friends in Portland that like, it was like the first time coming back to a city since college where you realize that some people were not paying attention to the weather every day because it might affect their schedule. And I tell people that I like moved to Portland and was like going out and meeting people and I asked, someone said, well, so what do you do? And I go, oh, I grow grapes. I grow grapes at this winery, and then we work in the cellar making the wines. And they said, but what else do you do? And I go, what do you mean? And they said, well, that's your job. What's your hobby? And I said, and they're like, so-and-so works at this shop, but plays in this band. Like, that's his passion. That's his pursuit. And this girl's like, she's like, and I do a lot of photography. She's like, do you have any pursuit outside of wine? And I was like, nope. Kind of been singular. kind of it's been all encompassing and consuming, but it made me, and she's like, but I didn't say it in I said it in a sheepish way, and she's like, oh. She's like, she kind of was like, well, that kind of makes you not interesting. And I just was like, oh. Like, you just realized that the bar was the bar was in Portland was like there, and that wasn't everyone, but it was kind of refreshing to be grounded and be in the city. And so working with Jim, again, I got to see wines through to barrel and carry them into bottling, and we did all of our bottling on site, and he really just gave me this landing pad to be in Oregon working, but I realized I went, after working with him and working a harvest, I kind of had this itch to kind of just get some space. And so he and I talked about me doing a Southern Hemisphere harvest, and it was going to be in South Africa, but a couple things fell through with scheduling, and so I ended up not going to this area, the Swartland, to make Syrahs. But then another friend of mine from Lincoln, from New Zealand, had worked for a guy named Stefano Lubiana in in Hobart in Tasmania. And a mutual friend of ours from Martinborough had just gotten a full-time job back in Martinborough. And so it was like 2 weeks before harvest, and Steve and Monique needed an extra hand. And so he said, hey, can I put your name in? And I said, sure. And they said, okay, tell us when you buy your plane ticket. And so I told Jim, I said, Jim, I got this opportunity. And Jim and I were kind of in this rocky situation where I think he knew I was unhappy with like the tension, and I was and so he said, okay. He's like, you can go, but we have to get everything, like we have to get this bottling done. And we have our own bottling machine, and we're bottling, and it was like a Thursday, and my plane ticket was on Sunday morning, and it looks like the bottling is going to extend into Saturday because of this breakdown. And he said to me on Thursday night, he goes, if we don't get everything bottled, he's like, you can tear your plane ticket up, like your stay. But again, that's not how I would operate. But that's how Jim operated, and I don't think he was like fully serious. But I just was like, oh, I gotta get away from this guy. But on the other end, it was a clear directive, and like That's who Jim is and kind of his style. And we got everything bottled by Friday night and cleaned up. And I think I went back in on Saturday and helped clean the cellar. And then I got on the plane on Sunday night. And it was a Sunday morning, midday, but it was like a 26-hour flight with time change to Tasmania. And I knew they were shorthanded. So when Monique was like, how am I going to know you like at the airport? And I just said, well, I'll wear this color shirt. And I mean, the Hobart airport's pretty small, but so show up, again, a place you don't know any idea on accommodations or any of that. And but Monique was there in the farm truck, and we drove the 40 minutes to the winery, and she's like, well, the guys are a little busy. They just pulled in another 40 tons of Chardonnay. And it's like 2 in the afternoon. And she goes, but you can rest, why don't you shower and rest? And I said, no, Monique, I came to work. And so I put on my boots and work pants, and we went and we worked till 10 that night, it was an awesome harvest, a really great small team. But that was another time where we worked. I think I was in Australia for 34 days, and I worked the first 30 nonstop. We did a half day for Easter, and then, but Italian family, Steve's dad came from Italy to the Barossa or to the Adelaide Hills as an Italian and made wines specifically for the Italian Australian community, but also for others. And then Steve took that winery and built it up and grew it and then sold it off. And then he's a real pioneer of Tasmanian wines. He moved down to Tasmania. It's probably been like 35 years ago. And before any of the other people in Australia started moving their sparkling productions and cool climate down there, he was like, this is the place. And he's another winemaker, kind of like what Larry said, where having this opportunity in Tasmania with he made this money selling his family's winery. He was always trying to do a Northern Hemisphere harvest. And sometimes he would go, he told me when I was working with him, he goes, if you are in Oregon and you start your own wine label, he goes, come call me. If you find me a place to sleep, I'll work for you for free. He's like, I'll run your cellar for you. He goes, so that you can figure out how to be a winemaker. And just never did pursue an idea to start my own label, but just this kind of generosity, but also this voraciousness for learning. The winemaker, Andy, who I worked with in Napa, said that he tried to read one wine article or book a week. Whether, maybe not the whole book, but just never saying like, oh, I know everything. It was always like, I got to turn over another leaf. I got to see what the press is saying about these wines or what's going on in this region, or read this academic paper. Just you don't ever take your foot off the gas on what you're exploring and thinking about. You don't take it for granted, kind of what you're doing. So I was in Tasmania, and again, I got to work with this Italian, they had an Italian intern named Alessio who had worked in Burgundy and was from Montepulciano, and he and I lived together and just saw just how other people did cellar work and did stuff. But I came back to J.K. Curie just being like, I don't want to work in this climate anymore. And I just needed to get out first, so I gave my notice, and I worked with Jim for 4 weeks. Well, it was going to be 2 weeks, and then he asked me to do 2 more weeks because IPNC was coming up. And then the one funny thing I will say about IPNC is it's like we're there at IPNC, and the first day, everyone stands up and announces what winery they're from. And I was like, well, after the day after tomorrow, I'm not working for J.K. Curie anymore, so I just kind of like stepped out of that line. And then the next day, and again, you're in this community with a lot of people you've all met through Jim, you've met through your boss. And then this next night, I'm pouring wines, and we're pouring, I think, the 10s or the 11s. We're on whatever night that was here at Linfield. And people are chatting with me, and then I'm pouring so Jim can mingle. And I go, Jim, I said, you've hired Chris whose name I'm blanking on, but Chris worked with him for 5 years and now is the winemaker at Silver Oak or Prince Hill. Chris Burrow, yeah. I was like, you hired Chris a couple of weeks ago. He's going to take on. I said, but no one seems to know that I'm leaving. And he goes, oh yeah. He's like, I figured you could tell them. So then for the last half an hour, I'm also a heavy pourer. If I was still on the winemaking side, I often give people more wine than they need. I would be pouring people, and people would be like, how are you liking working at J.K. Carrier? I'm like, good, I'm done in an hour. Or like, I'm done. It was like, whatever, or like, oh, I'm done tomorrow type of a thing. And that was kind of fun because it was like, oh, it's like, I'm a free agent again. But it kind of gave me this perspective on like, okay, what do I want to do? And that kind of engendered a few conversations with people. And I think the thing I realized was on that learning point we've been talking about, I was like, besides my time in Virginia, I got to work I knew nothing about agriculture. I didn't come from an agricultural family. I didn't do undergrad studies in it. I was a Boy Scout. Eagle Scout. I feel like I knew about nature, but I'd worked that one whole season, and then every other time it's like I came to Napa in July and I worked for a few months helping out in the vineyard, and the same in New Zealand. In Martinborough, it was more working with the crew. It was more crew work, and I was like, when am I going to get a chance to like really understand growing? Like, I could go chase an assistant winemaker job in the month before harvest, but it was July. It's like, if anyone's hiring an assistant winemaker right now, are they actually going to be that enjoyable to work with? Like, are they going to be? I feel like I sound like I really knew what I was doing, or that I'm a prima donna. But I just knew it was like one more leaf I wanted to turn over. And I always kind of knew I always had inklings towards it. And so I worked the harvest with friends at Chehalem Winery. And then I started talking with Stirling Fox. And he said, I don't really have a position for you right now, but you can work as a tractor driver. And I worked as a hourly tractor driver with no overtime. 60, 70 hours a week. The expectation, ag overtime has changed things now in the last couple of years, but like I was working 6 days a week spraying. And as the season progressed and as our clients shifted, I did more and more for Stirling wine grapes. And then after 1 year, I got one more winemaking stint. Stirling's wife, Kelly, is a winemaker. And her intern was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, and she wasn't going to make it in time for harvest. And so Stirling, partway into harvest, goes, would you consider going to the Carlton winemaking studio and helping my wife make wines? And I said, really? And he goes, yeah. He's like, I realize when you have someone on your staff who's done 15 vintages and been an assistant winemaker, and they currently are driving flatbed trucks of fruit around, that the better thing for a husband to do is share the resource. So I got to go to the Carlton winemaking studio and work with Kelly, which was enjoyable. But the last few harvests, really, like Tasmania, I tell people going to Tasmania and then working at Chehalem, and that when you come out of the level of being the decision maker and you just get to be like the worker, it's freeing because you learn how to do it. It was frustrating too because you want to do things a certain way, but it was also very freeing because it's just like, oh, Kelly's asked me to move this tank to this tank and do this, and I'll clean this, and I'll chat with this person on the way, and it just was pleasant. It went back to being like, the work was enjoyable. You weren't like white knuckling it, being like, am I going to screw this up? It's like, I know how to do this. And this is the job I got to do today and do. At the same time, I had like existential dread of like, what's the future? Like, what am I doing? I'm working I got married that fall, and I was like, where is my career going when I'm just like working an hourly wage job with all this experience. But Stirling came, and I talked post-harvest, and I went and I worked with him. And we had about 100 acres in the Chehala Mountains and Ribbon Ridge area that I managed the sites for. And that working in vineyard management is, again, back to that thing about being like land, capital. Each client is a different one of like, some need to rent the equipment, some own all their equipment, some have really great sites, some have a lot of money and they don't mind using it type of thing, but you're kind of redoing that gymnastics with each one. And what I tell people starting out in viticulture especially is it's like working in a vineyard management company, there's nothing like knowing that you have a place where you're spraying every day of the week, right? It kind of like in harvest, it's this repetition of tasks. And so if you get to experience something or repeat a growing cycle 10 times across 10 sites, it doesn't add up to 10 years, but adds up to like, it's 10 iterations of the same set again and again. And so I worked with Stirling for 3.5 years at that stint, and a couple things happened. One, I wanted to kind of move up and be a decision maker and have more growth. And two, with those clients, you're always on call and you always have these duties. And my wife, I really wanted to start having kids, and my wife worked a full-time job and values her career and was like, how are we ever going to do kids if you're working every Saturday in the vineyard, like what, and I want to work, what is the balanced load? And so I picked my spot, and in 2017, I went and started working for Anime Vineyards as their vineyard manager for their 2 sites, and did that for 5 years of my professional career. And again, another step of maturity and really having to be responsible for your budget and own a department, and that was the first time when you get into like HR growth and HR and people. And I think, but that was also the time where it was really kind of empowering because it was like my team. And I think the biggest growth and challenge at Anime is that it went through some real financial hiccups and contractions that went a lot of different places, but that all happened in 2019 going into 2020. And on a personal note, we had our first kid that September, right in the middle of harvest, like a good vineyard manager. And then, so those hiccups were 2019, and then 2020, they put some properties up for sale. They sold off some of the best Pinot blocks and put the winery up for sale. But we then had the COVID pandemic, and our head winemaker, who'd been there for years, Thomas Hausman, exited for all the right choices and did work in Michigan. And the other senior associate winemaker, Andy, why am I blanking on his name, but he works for Castile now. He left, so the long, steady hands left, and we had two assistant winemakers who got elevated, all still during the pandemic, and then the wildfires happened. And in a certain way, I realized during that time, it was like, oh, I'm now at the company on the production side, I'm the one who's been here for the most number of years of senior leadership. Of like, Kent and Gabby have been here, but more kind of in a junior role where you're just like not in the daily meetings. But we were also dealing with an ownership that was like trying to figure out if we should even harvest fruit and go through all that. And we had, Anime was fortunate, we had our own in-house crew connected to Columbia Empire Farms, when we started Anime, we had about 230 acres of berries and several hundred acres of hazelnuts. And so all those, plus the 140 acres of grapes, were all under the same kind of farming company. And I was the sole worker for Anime Vineyards, but I worked with Columbia Emperor Farms, the sister farming company. So during the pandemic, myself and this Santiago Garza, who is the berry manager, were the ones who, and he's like, well, we're all just going to get this. And this was in February. And I said, I don't know. It's only in the nursing homes, you know. And then they were discussing, CDC put out a mask suggestion. And so we looked into doing masks, and then they retracted it. But Santiago and I decided we wanted to start doing it and telling other people around. So what I'm saying is, like, that time was a great professional growing time, but it was also a time when I realized, or I got to a level where I realized that how I handled things had a trickle-down effect and a ripple effect. And I think I've talked about some of the harder times working when you're just one of the pieces, one of the seasonal workers, or one of these things where like you're kind of like, oh man, this is just a grind, or this, you know, like this. But realizing that, especially when you're in a leadership position or when you're just the boss, your way of handling things, your outlook can insulate or at least decrease any of the major waves. And that was, I felt that was the biggest, that was one of the reasons I stayed on longer at Anime, was because with this upheaval, I had day-to-day workers, you know, who I was working with, who I just was like, I want to just make sure that their workflow system stays the same. And it's probably something like, I didn't think I was Superman. I don't think I was like, and I don't want to be patronizing about it, you know, like I wasn't doing the work for them, but I think I had seen and learned that, like, you as a boss, as a manager, but also just as a participant, can affect the culture. And then in 2022, well, in the winter of 2021, I was talking with Stirling, and he said, let's go out for lunch. And we went out to lunch, and he said, well, would you ever come back and work for me? And I said, maybe. You know, like, vineyard management's a lot of, the management company with clients is a lot of work and all that. And he goes, but you said maybe. And I said, yes. And he goes, okay, he's like, let's keep this going. Let's have lunch again soon. And I was like, no, I don't want to waste your time. And he said, you're not wasting my time. He goes, because he's like, I can put a resume, I can ask for resumes and place an ad, and I can sift through them. He goes, or I can go out to lunch with a former employee who we are friends with, and I can expense the lunch, and we can chat about it. And he's like, it's actually like a better use of my time. And so he wore me down after a few lunches. And I came back to work with him. It's been over 3 years now, and I've shifted into a role of doing more of the technical farming, so fertilization and spray programs and planning of things, which was personally part aptitude, and then also a part, I mentioned though, over time, and I think we're learning that with ag workers, but I think as a growing professional adult, it's this understanding of, like, I moved into this technical side as well because my wife wanted to go, we moved to McMinnville, my wife wanted to go back to work with a 2-year-old. She quit in the middle of the pandemic from her job, and then she wanted to go back to work, and she ended up working for a shoe brand, not Nike, but the Swiss shoe brand. And two people working full-time demanding jobs, I think often in the wine industry, like, there's an expectation, oh, it's harvest, you know, like everything just drops, you know, and I had seen that and witnessed that and worked with a lot of families that made it work and do things, and I think the story of agriculture and farming is very much that. But it was always me trying to find a balance with her, and it's a daily balance, but to go and do this with Stirling wine grapes, I mean, we're finding it now with our own crews, because I think now in the 21st century, there's this like, you can't always have this expectation, oh, you like have this person for 70 hours a week, like even if they're a contract laborer or however it is, it's just this expectation. And I think I'm wandering now, but I think that's something that when I was at NME and what I've seen the most in the Oregon wine industry is, I think it's easy to put the pin in when Jackson family came in. I remember in 2017, a lot of peers, people 5-10 years older than me, felt really threatened by it. And I think some of that cause was good, but I also was like, a new level of professionalism is going to come into the Oregon wine industry. We're going to get paid, like I'm going to get paid for having done a grad school education. Because when I came to Oregon in 2009, it was a little, and when I was interviewing for jobs in 2011 or 12 when I moved up here, a lot of people said, well, you've only worked one Oregon wine harvest. How can you work here? And I was like, but I've grown and worked with Pinot Noir and like for 4 or 5 different vintages, and I've done this. But this kind of, it was the same thing I saw in Virginia that I decided I never went back to Virginia. I thought I was going to go back after 2 or 3 years, but like a little bit of like a tribal knowledge of like, but this is the way we do it, and so everything kind of has to fork out from there. Where with Jackson family, and I think with where we are in the 21st century now, it's not as much mom and pop, and I don't want it to become corporatized. It's not as mom and pop. I don't want it to be corporatized, but I do think there's a better happy medium of like, we're all pursuing this goal, or we're just being industrious in the Willamette Valley. I think I'm reminded that like people have been growing a lot of crops on this land for thousands of years, or harvesting crops too. But for some people that it's just the new crop to be growing, and for others it is a pursuit. It's a pursuit across the country or from another country or something like that. But that we all like, there's not the license to have it to be such a doggedly pursuit that you're doing it forever. Like that it's a all-encompassing 90-hour-a-week type of a job. There's some pioneers and founders and iconoclasts that have done that, but for some of us too, there's a balance of like, no, it's a privilege to be in a good field, like an interesting field or economy, but it's not. Yeah, you can't just hang up other duties.
So you finally developed some other interests outside of wine eventually, is what you're saying.
Still working on it. I think I've always had other interests. Like I talk about like the studying abroad. I mean, when I studied abroad in Scotland, they kind of pushed me into courses, and we read every book of Thomas Hardy, which was about 8 books too many if he wrote about 13. But as an English major, you do and then my other course was on Zionism, which continually is interesting even in the year 2025, and about the formation of the nation state of Israel. But it's like, okay, when I think about it, it's like, I've reread some Thomas Hardy books. I do think about the nation state of Israel, but I think about jazz a lot more and blues, and I also think about wine a lot, and so I think when you talk about developing other interests, it's like, yeah, I think I have other interests, but I don't know if they're on the back burner or when they're going to simmer up and be the like, not main event, but if it's going to be like, it's like, I drink less wine. I bragged to people when I finally moved out of the youth hostel and got a room in an apartment, and then later, before I started dating my wife, I bragged to people that I spent more money each month for like 5 or 6 months on wine than I did on gas, rent, and food combined. And I wasn't making much, right? I was like helping people bottle, and then I started working for Jim. But I was like, it's it's like, I've been buying a lot of bottles of wine and just drinking and tasting and how fun that was. And then I started dating my wife and she was in Seattle, and then you have to start taking someone out to eat instead of like buying a nice bottle of wine and eating Ryvita crackers or something. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sacrifices,
yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of, you mentioned for a lot of your career, you're kind of balancing back and forth, winemaking, viticulture, sometimes both at the same time, sometimes going back and forth. Tell me about going to work for Stirling the first time and then going to NME and being kind of entirely focused at that point on the vineyard side. Why that side? Why was that the side you kind of came down on? And what was it like sort of focusing on, I guess, half of the equation after a career kind of doing both?
Yeah, I think going and working for Stirling after 1 year and being a tractor driver, which again, I think it is like grinding work, right? I mean, it seems like, oh, you're in an air-conditioned cab or not, you know, but you're driving circles, you're not in a hand crew situation. But I think what I realized was, one, the same thing I talked about walking vineyards, was it was like, I use this line at NME a lot. I would tell people that the worst day in the vineyard is here, or like you can put it here. The worst day in the cellar is here. The best day in the cellar, the best day as a winemaker, I think in my opinion, could be way, you know, there's probably a higher ceiling. It's probably a higher ceiling. And it's probably sometime when you're eating caviar or you're in a room with people that just love you and want to like wrap their arms around you and fill your pockets with money and do all that sort of stuff. But the worst day in the cellar, and I've experienced some of them, are the labels are wrong, you're trying to bottle, something's broken, it has to happen today, because something's coming tomorrow to pick the wine up, or the this, or your math is wrong, and I have not actually experienced this, I've heard about this, your math is wrong, and you owe the TTB more money in back taxes than you really, you know, just like this, like, where did this go type of thing, where in agriculture, there's always this, like, being the now is too cliche, but it's just like, we're gonna work through this. So what personally, what I found in agriculture, which maybe goes back generations in my family and I never knew, is the seasonality really makes sense. The pragmatism of like, you're building a season. When I talked about this a lot, again, this is something I talk to people about, but like house painting. In a perfect house painting situation, you come to a wood house if you're hand painting, and you're gonna scrape those chips off. You might have to prune back some rose bushes, but you're gonna scrape those chips off, get as much of the loose matter off, and then you're gonna sand it down, then you're gonna prime that wood to get a protective coat that you can adhere, sand again, and then you're gonna start painting. And the whole goal is, if you do all this prep work, and my boss would talk about this, but I realize it is true. If you have all the prep work done well, you can not have great brush skills, and you can dip your brush in a can of paint and it feels like it just goes forever. Like, you can do a full arm stroke and there's no drips because the wall is ready to receive the paint, and it's just a smooth state of play. The table is set, and all you're doing is kind of like setting it down. And what I see in viticulture is like pretty much the exact same thing. If you are in the perfect piece of land, which would be like the perfect house, but if you have your pruning right, that's actually going to make your vegetative canopy management easier. And so on a personal level, I like that you weren't doing the same task over and over again. You're kind of building through the progression of it. The seasonality of like having 3 months in the winter to repair tractors and look at spreadsheets and drink tea and listen to jazz music and do all that, and read, like right now as a leader or a professional or a manager, a boss, like read academic work, talk with friends, do all that stuff, but then also know it's a little harder with kids, but like when it's long days like this, sometimes great to be out at 5:30 in the morning. And I still tell my wife, it's harder again with kids, but when you have, like, one of my favorite days to work in the vineyard is on a Saturday, because on a Saturday, usually different than if you're in the winery on a Saturday when people are tasting and all this. On a Saturday, if you go out in the vineyard, usually your crew is doing a task that's really important, but no vendor is going to call you, no winemaker is going to call you. You just have this kind of time of focus to be present. So the vineyard just seemed like it seemed like the more manageable, lifelong arena of being a winemaker. For me, always seemed like you're making a wine for yourself, but really for other people, and it's a marketing piece, and you have to know how to market it. And I just don't have that brain work. I don't have that. I either have self-doubt about the work I do, or inner criticism, or I don't know if people are like it, where on the grape growing side, you're looking at one plant of 1,000 something in the acre. And the other thing I learned working in the vineyard was there's a lot of amazing people who work in agriculture, but especially, again, I grew up in Vermont, second whitest state in the country. The most minority, we have like a 1.4% minority of Asians. So I did not grow up with Latino culture. I did take Spanish in middle school and high school, and when I came to NME, I realized that in the grape growing division, I was the only first language English speaker. That the berry manager, everyone else, first language was Spanish, and I had always used Spanish as like a hail cab, get here, type of thing. But I realized that it should be on me to learn Spanish because I have the time and resources, but also I realized practically, I want to be able to speak Spanish so that a Spanish speaker could say, I don't understand you. Can you be clearer, rather than expecting them to relate that to me in English and say, can you say that in a different way? But what I want to say about the crew and the Latino culture and just the farm culture in general is it picks you up. Like, your worst day in the vineyard, and that can be having a tractor up to its axles in mud. It can be, I remember an evening on Ribbon Ridge when I got a call from a nursery that they had decided to send the plants to this vineyard a day early, but the truck would be there at 7:30 at night. And I had crew workers that said, I had 2 carloads, and they said, yeah, we'll work till 7:30 if you'll roll some of our hours into the next day. And so we kept raising wires and working, and I was living in Portland at the time, so I don't think I got home till 9:30, but the truck showed up at 7:30, and it took 15-20 minutes of hand loading, unloading trays. But the workers were like, the crew just was like, we're in this together. And when I worked at NME, there's a very practical thing. Again, we were working with families that had been working on this property for years and years, and with the berries and with the hazelnuts. And I realized we would have situations where we'd have too much fruit in a block, or a block that the winery, the production, wouldn't want to use. And I'd ask the ownership, they said, well, just thin it away or get rid of it. I said, no, let me sell it. Like, let me use connections and sell it. But I also realized that we maybe would defer our farming costs and make things look good, which we did. And we made money for the company, and the family and the corporation. But I was like, every extra ton is more harvest picking money for my stable crew. And that, I would say, that's a way where I tried to pay back some of that, like, everyone's wins, everything's fair. But yeah, there's just a camaraderie. I think there's even a camaraderie in the Oregon wine industry. I've been a part of this Oregon Grape Growers Organic group that Rob Schultz at Lemelson started. And I think I've been to it since its inception 4 years ago. And like, I have competitors in the room, I mean, and people who annoy me, right? Like, I don't think I have any like nemesis, but there's people who like annoy you, or you disagree with how they do stuff. But there's also a level of, hey, I have a question. Let's share it. Let's talk it over. Let's not evaluate how you got in this situation. Some people are more or less open to hearing what you have to do. I actually kind of also goes back to when I think about generosity. Ted at Literati said this, but also Larry when I was at Escarpment. They talked about their wines, and when Larry said, "Don't ask me the why," or the when, ask me the how do you do this, and you decide what you want to do and apply. And Ted would say this thing of, he's like, I'll tell you whatever you want to know about how we're making wine, and I'll tell you what I'm tasting. He goes, but I can guarantee you, if you have this bin of fruit and I have this bin of fruit, you're never going to make the same wine as me. And that's a little bit of winemaker culture, a little of like, my wine's always going to command the price, or, where I built this reputation. But he goes, we're going to go down the road and have different decisions and and maybe that was as a harvest intern and you've paid your dues, but they're opening their book and they're letting you talk through everything. And there's plenty of winemakers who only let you see parts of the book, or they don't actually really want to share what they're thinking, or they don't want to share, like, they don't want to express self-doubt. But I think on the grower level side of things, you go somewhere and you go, interesting. Why did you decide to do it that way? There's plenty of growers in that organic growers group who I wouldn't really want to farm their way. I wouldn't farm that way. I wouldn't make those decisions. But I'm not responsible. I'm not responsible for it. But I'm also there, like, to hear how they're doing it and then to share how I'm doing it. As a vineyard management company, it's a little weirder because you do have clients, and the clients don't always want stuff expressed. But on the grower side, there's just this, I think it's like, yeah, you're never going to farm the same piece of dirt. You're never going to, and then I think, I like being in Oregon. New Zealand taught me this too. It's like, there's only a few dozen, there's more than a few dozen, but if you're talking about vineyard manager, like really thinking about it, there's only, a few dozen to maybe 50 people in this northern Willamette area really like thinking this over. And if you think about in the state and in California, we're talking like several hundred, right? And some are not taking it as seriously as others, and others are taking it way too seriously, or have their head way too far up their lab coats, or whatever you want to say. And so like, it's like you're bonded by this special thing, so why hide it too much? I think. And we've talked about this with our organic growers group just recently at the conference too. Like Luisa Ponzi and Jason Lett were there, and we were talking about like work schedules. And it's like, there's a lot of people who've like paved the way here in Oregon. And when I got the full-time job at Anime as a 32-year-old and felt like I finally had arrived at a professional level, I was like, wow, I feel like, doesn't mean I'm never going to be unemployed, but if I want to pursue wine grape growing, like I'm in one of the best places in the world to pursue it naturally, climatically, industry-wise. Land's still relatively cheap, compared to trying to go to Burgundy or something, something like that. So there was just this like, oh, like I'm established, When I drove around with Jim Prosser, we were somewhere here in McMinnville, and we were looking at house prices, and I was like working for him, and I think he had kept me on hourly but was paying me overtime. And he's like, why are you so grumpy? And this is jumping back. And I said, I'm never going to be able to afford a house. I was like, and he's like, give it time. And I was like, no, I'm never going to be able to, I'm working for you. I'm never gonna, and I want to make it like I'm an underpaid type thing. And he's like, no, just give it time. And then it's like 4 or 5 years later, though I had to go become an hourly tractor driver, 4 or 5 years later, I was there buying a house with my wife in Southwest Portland, and then selling it and moving to McMinnville and buying a house, and just realizing that, like, on a certain level, not everyone gets that luxury, but there is if we grow the industry in a fair way, everyone in the community should gain and grow from it. And that has to go to the workers, and I mean, ICE and this immigration stuff is its own thing, but I think it's also like how we reflect on how we develop the county or the surrounding counties, and how we represent Oregon. And it's interesting because there's a lot of competing viewpoints. I mean, it's interesting as in, like, I don't know what the answer is. There's on what the future of Oregon has, but I think some of it is to preserve the hard work that has been put in the prior decades. But so shifting back to what you're saying about vineyards, I think for me, I felt like I was going to have more endurance and rhythm pursuing this for a lifetime or for a full career. That the balance of it was interesting. And I tell people, besides the winemaking and the marketing and the sales side of that, I still probably have that same interest I had as a college student, where it's like, I tell people, it's like, I work with my crew in Spanish and we work as a team. I know enough mechanical knowledge, I do my own oil changes and stuff like that, but I know enough mechanical to help mechanics problem solve, source parts, fabricate stuff to improve vineyard equipment. I'm on the Oregon Wine Board's grant reviewing committee, so I work with academics. I've worked with Patty Skinkis in her extension group, but also talking with her years ago. Partially me was the reason why we have this Adopt a Researcher program, where people can can choose to partner up with one researcher for a year and have 6 or 7 people in the viticulture field or the winery field, and just kind of meet and brown bag lunch it. And after we talked about that program, I read this program about all apple trees are now being planted on dwarf rootstock or semi-dwarf rootstocks. And the rootstocks, some are from Russia, I think some are from Turkey or Romania, but there's a couple major strains. But this rootstock work started in Minnesota. In Minnesota, it might not be exactly correct, but it started because this one guy had a farm and he was talking with a researcher, and they were originally, all apple trees were being grown as these really tall, get huge ladders, and the canopy just kept going up and up and up. And the researcher said, I think we can start using these couple strains of rootstocks to diminish the size, control growth, and like wine grapes we've been doing for hundreds of years. And the researcher said, I just need to put in practice. And the farmer said, well, you can do an acre at my place. And that was 60 years ago, but it completely changed the apple industry because one farmer allowed an experiment to happen, and it was a very novel experiment. But it's like, oh, I have a resource, I have this land, which a researcher doesn't have, I'm going to use it. And I think there's something about growing when we're not commodity growers, which is, we're not all trying to grow the same amount of rice to sell and try to get into different markets. We're all kind of growing for separate clients. So we also have this ability to pool our knowledge in a way that we're not working against each other, where maybe that's felt more on the winemaking side. But so as a career, yeah, you get to have this scientific academic realm, you get to have this personal realm working with crews, you have a tangible result. I mean, whether that's watching the fruit come off the vine or seeing the wine made out of it, there's a purpose to it that's very much there. And then each season's different. And the seasons are marked by climactic reasons, but also by, I mean, like, I've only, like, I read stuff on settlers and stuff, right, as a historian, and only now am I like I can tell you the year, my other son was born in August, but it's like, I can tell you what those years were like as a growing season in the lens of having a pregnant wife and finishing harvest with a young baby at home, and just like, so, and I tell people it's like my first 4 years in the wine industry in Virginia, Napa, Oregon, well, the first 3, each one of those in the middle of harvest, I had a grandparent pass away. And funerals were delayed for 2, but you're in the middle of this thing as like a 20-something-year-old, and you're on one level, you're thinking about what your mom or dad's going through, and on another level, you're thinking about, but that whole season is also, that's an overshadowing thing. And I think there's something that's more alive about being in a landscape and then also having this personal landscape than, and it's why, like, and again, living here in the Willamette Valley, I just love it for so many reasons. It reminds me of Vermont, but it's different. It's not as crowded as California, but you get to build these memories, and they're just building each year. And there's years when you learn stuff like, oh, that was the year when this piece of equipment just wouldn't run for the life of it, you know, or that was the year when everything really worked out great, you know, or just little stuff.
So let's talk about the future a little bit, both for yourself and for the Oregon wine industry. Tell me about looking ahead for yourself, both sort of personally and professionally. What have you not done yet that you hope to do? Is there anything on your horizon? And kind of expanding from that, for the Oregon wine industry, where do you see your role in it as it grows?
I think one thing I've been challenged by, and we talked about this a little, again, I don't think I've learned everything, is like a lot of the work I've done in the last few years has been, like at Anime, I talk about, I was like the only manager, I was the only great person at Anime, and then we had this farming company. And technically none of them were my direct reports, but also, I mean, we built a system and worked together, but I think what I see that probably in the next 10 or 15 years is I do think I want to learn to be a better teacher and to share things. And right now that's setting up systems and for like Stirling wine grapes and for the company. But I think it's also this, I think I want to, like in the last couple months, I've been more realizing I want to figure out how to communicate what I know better, and also communicate better what I still have questions about and ask, rather than like stumbling into an answer, being a little more like, oh, how am I going to pursue and find this? And, you know, thinking about this, so we had this organic wine growers conference in February or March at Alexana, and one of the organizers said, we need people to do talks, you know, for these like round robin kind of pop through. Would you be willing to talk? And I said, great. And they said, you're gonna speak with Di Crisp of Temperance Hill and a guy named Jackson Grom, who I knew, who was at Lingua Franca but just started at Abbott Claim as their vineyard manager. And so it was just gonna be Di and me, and then they said, okay, we want to add Jackson in your group. And it goes, okay. And they said, maybe think about soil and organic farming, or, you know, like in the history of soil in the Willamette Valley. And I tried to be more thought forward in planning. And so I started the email and I said, I don't really want to talk about, I'm not a geologist, and we've all heard the story of the Missoula floods. Like, can we actually talk about how farming affects our decision making and planning? Let's meet and have a coffee and talk about it. And Jim Prosser actually introduced me to Di Crisp because we were sourcing fruit from him. And I tell people it's like I had to rebuild a sprayer while working for Jim. and it was a sprayer Dye had sold or lent Jim. And so I was taking this pump apart and calling Rears Manufacturing in Eugene and trying to figure it all out. But one thing was, Dye actually called me twice during those 2 weeks, and I don't know if it was Jim being like, what's taking so long? But Dye called me personally and said, hey, how's it going? Is there anything I can do to help? Or I'm swinging by, and to have someone who you'd only met like once or twice say, hey, I want to just take a look. And so we met at Flag and Wire for coffee, Dye, Jackson, and I, and Jackson kind of like had his points lined up and organized. And I don't think you have to edit this. I think you'd be fine. But he goes, this is the first time I've actually like stood up in front of a group of people about a wine topic. He's like, he's like, I'm a little nervous. Like I really want to have my plans planned out. And Dye goes, whoa, let's just appreciate that for a minute. And he's like, and Dye's like, I actually come from, and I didn't know this, he comes from an acting background, and his dad was a speech coordinator. And Dye's like, we're all in this to support each other. And he's like, we're all having this conversation together in front of these people. And he said it in this way. And then the three of us started talking, and I was realizing that I had almost 20 years of experience, and Dye had over 40. And then here's Jackson with, I want to say like 5 to 7 or something, but all at different ends of the spectrum. But we all get to talk about the same topic, how soil is affecting our decision making. And so we kind of like teased that out about lingua franca versus temperance versus, I ended up talking about the Dundee Hills and some of the sites we farmed there because they were all joy. And it all went really well, and Jackson like had a great time. Dye and I both were like, wow, we had to talk too many times. It's like you have that high and it was good, but then by the third or fourth group, it's like, okay, I'm ready for a cough drop. And this is why I'm not a winemaker. I don't want to talk with people all the time. But that was like a cool experience to me because it was just like, oh, it's like I've learned from Dye over the last decade, but here's a chance to work with Jackson. And then the half of our conversation with Jackson was he had worked in commercial organic vegetable crops, and neither Dye or I really know how to grow a tomato well. And it's like, oh, so you have someone who just has this different experience, went to school like more recently than you, and just a different exposure level. So I think it's that's where it's like strengthening those relationships, and kind of like what I said about with what Larry said, it's like, I think I know the questions. It's like filling in and finding out where you need more support. And as new problems arise, what's the answer for that? I mean, we're all asking about climate change. I think we're all asking also about immigration a little, but immigration's maybe less clear because it's a policy, but it's like, I mean, the grape market is its own question. When and how is it going to rebound? So, and then for the Oregon wine industry, I think like when we review research that the Oregon Wine Board is going to fund, a lot is this building to our pool of knowledge or to like kind of a threat or a new topic? And then also, does it address us specifically? And I think for me, when I first came and I stayed at this youth hostel in Hawthorne in Portland, and I found out in the first week or two that the Oregon Wine Symposium was going to be happening up the street. And I like looked at my money pool and said, I guess I'll just buy a ticket and go, and I went and I just mingled. But they were talking about Oregon being like 0.7% of the nation's wine. And now I think we're almost up to 2% or 2.3%, but how California and Washington have influxed, but a lot of it has just been Oregon growing. And to be in that room in 2012 in February, and then to be in it in 2024, and have peers from school in New Zealand who are in different parts of Australia, New Zealand, Europe, East Coast, and all them, when Anime is going through all this turbulence and all of that, it's like, you're in the hottest region in the world. Like, why would you, don't chicken out. Not don't chicken out, but like, have courage. And it's like, yeah, I think there's a lot of natural resilience that is in the Willamette Valley as a natural, like as in the natural world, but then also with how the industry, we have not yet hit like a false peak or like a, I think maybe we've had little ones, but I don't think we've grown out of control as an industry that would cause us to like have a rapid deflate or change. And so I think that's where I'm wary, like I'm wary of like not pouring gas on the fire and trying to get things too big. But some of that's also easier to say when I say where I feel like I have a middle-class lifestyle and feel comfortable, in my surrounding, like, and there's other people who are coming in and want to be at the table. So, yeah.
Perfect. All right. So those are all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that I should have, or anything else you wanted to cover before I let you go today?
No, I feel like I ran on.
You have a fascinating story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us. So
Thanks.
Thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your story with us, and going to let you off the hook.
Thank you.
Thank you.